away with the preliminary stuff, and then we'll jump into the conversation about the benchmarking.
Sure, no problem at all. So what I said as far as the intro is sort of wellness and lifestyle and learning suite are two of the most experienced organizations, both from a learning perspective and a healthcare learning perspective. When you were talking about, by way of intro, you've dealt with over 150 sort of care homes and care home groups. And when we're talking around funding, nothing seems to resonate or be as hot a topic at the moment as funding. And when we were talking sort of benchmarking, was there anything in particular from a funding perspective why is it such a hot topic, I guess?
Yeah, I guess one of the things is at the moment, because of all the industry changes, people are paying a lot more attention to what their current financial situation is and preparing for the changes, because they want to know what the impact of next year's changes are. And I guess the key point that keeps popping up is, people are leaning out the window, having a look down the road, seeing how they're performing compared to other organisations, and trying to use that as a bit of a comparison regarding where they sit in the market. But then they're also trying to apply what's been put forward as the average impact of the ACFI changes as well. And I guess from a financial sustainability perspective, there's quite a few dangers that are involved in using that process of analytics that a lot of organisations may not have taken into consideration. And if it impacts your decision-making process and your allocation of resources, next year when these rather large changes take place, that could actually ultimately be the straw that breaks the camel's back regarding an organisation keeping its doors open.
Okay. Cool. So so from a presentation perspective, I'll happily go through this. For some reason, it's allowing me to control, but not necessarily yourself. So can you see those slides coming up?
Yes. Yep.
Cool. So we're basically here, as I said, to assist care operators with the knowledge for how to receive all of their funding entitlements promptly and sustainably. And something that you mentioned earlier that's incredibly important is that this is really about the areas that they can control, and that it's all about that this is effectively that they're entitled to this. There's no sort of smoke and mirrors here. There's no sort of pushing the envelope. These are funding and methodologies that care homes and care home operators are rightfully entitled to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the analogy I like to use is you can't control the price of petrol, but you can control how tuned up your car is, the type of car you drive, and how you actually drive it. So it's one of those things, unfortunately, as much as we like to lobby the government, the prices they've given us are the prices that we have, but there are so many other factors in relation to how we perform financially that people can control, and most importantly, without taking unnecessary risks, without overclaiming, and just as importantly, by making sure they're getting all the funding they should be in the majority of times for the care they're already providing. And that's where the benchmarking comes. Is quite dangerous, because people think that how the V8 is performing, that's always doing burnouts, is the same, and we should be comparing it to the VW diesel as well. So, and that's why I like to talk about benchmarking and just point out that in some cases it can be a useful tool, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all to highlight how we're performing as an organisation.
Yep. So in your effective professional opinion, it's much easier to control what you do around benchmarking your ACFI claims than trying to lobby the government to get more money.
Absolutely.
So something that sort of resonates quite a lot is when we speak to care homes, and obviously there's some care homes do audits, etc. This statistic I find is quite telling, that close to 85% of all care operators do not receive all of their eligible funding. And can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so look, I guess one of the key points is, as an organisation, when we're going and visiting aged care homes, we've only actually been to 3 aged care facilities where we haven't found the funding they're eligible for based on the care they're already providing. Now, having said that, we have gone to some organisations who do have rather high levels of ACFI funding, and in some cases they may have some inherent validation risk for some cohorts of residents and their ACFI claims. But we might see Joe Bloggs on one hand who maybe his care needs a change and the funding is getting the organisation is getting more funding than the care they're currently providing, which obviously has some validation risks. But then when we look down the corridor, we find little Betsy, who is underclaimed by one or two categories as well. So what we look at is sometimes the benchmarking drives behaviours that leads to, let's just say, a higher risk appetite for some claims, whereas there's actual funding to be gained just by looking more broadly, looking at every resident in the facility and making sure we're actually getting all the funding we should be for all of the residents. So it's very rare that we actually come across an organisation where they've optimised their processes to capture all of the resident changes and get the funding they should be for every resident.
Okay. So what I might do, Michael, is if you've got your computer on, I'll make you the presenter to go through the various bits, so you can sort of take control from this particular area. It's absolutely amazing. So based on what you've just said, is having visited close to over 150 care homes, only 3 have you found that basically did not have claims that you could find that they were actually entitled to. So that's quite a telling statistic. Something else, Michael, is that seems to come up is that the actual, when you're talking about, say, benchmarking and ACFI, that it's not just a thing about finance, is it? It actually is a better clinical outcome, or what are the linkages between the clinical outcomes and actually better ACFI management?
I guess one of the things is when we've got processes in place where anytime there's a resident care need and there's a change, that process is highlighted by floor staff. It's then communicated to the team leader. The care plan is updated. That care plan update is communicated to the ACFI staff and a subsequent claim is made. When we actually look at the first step in that process, if the care staff are in tune of identifying anytime there's a discrepancy between the care plan and the resident's care needs, then when that care plan gets updated and that change is communicated to all of the staff that are providing care for that resident, they all actually know what's expected of them. So, let's say we have a resident who is no longer coping well with toileting independently, and now they're requiring that supervision and prompting for that post-toileting hygiene, etc. It may only be 1 or 2 staff members that pick that up. If the care plan still says they're independently and there's a perception that the resident's independent, then the other staff members may not identify that there's actually help that has to be provided. But by updating the documentation to truly reflect the resident's care needs, you get an agency staff member, someone who comes back from annual leave, or just the other staff in the areas, they actually know what's expected of them and their resident outcomes improve.
Okay. Cool. Well, thank you. So when we're talking specifically about benchmarking, there's obviously a few points that when we sent out their webinar topic, and why do you see benchmarking as dangerous? And one of the first things you were talking about is this thing called average daily bed rates. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, so look, I guess one of the key things is that, many organisations, they get emailed this single way for summary at the end of each month and say, hey, this is how you're performing compared to the benchmark. Now, that in itself is a dangerous comparison, and to be honest, it's a marketing tool, because when we look at these figures up here, now these are the department's own stats. The average national daily bed rate is $162.69. So you might say as an organisation, awesome, well I'm getting $164, I'm doing better than the national average. Well, the average for metropolitan cities is $168.17.
Okay.
So if you actually compare that same rate to that one, you're actually underperforming. Now, if you say, but I'm a not-for-profit organisation, well, the not-for-profit average is $157.75. So there's benchmarks, but it depends on how you slice and dice it. I could say, yes, I'm claiming $167, depending on which benchmark I use, whether it's the department's own stats because of the national average, remoteness, for-profit versus for-profit status, and there's also state averages, and there's actually also averages based on a provider's size. So if you get a A4 piece of paper that's all bright and shiny, and it actually says this is how you're performing compared to the average, well, what average are they using? Are they just choosing one to make the organisation look underfunded? Is someone choosing a average and a benchmark to make them perform better than the average in their cohort? And I guess just want to highlight that because no organisation is the same, it's so dangerous to use a benchmark. If every organisation was a 100-bed for-profit facility in the CBD and you all had the same admission strategy, yeah, then maybe benchmarking is useful.
Okay, so and I guess for on the benchmarking, obviously, as you're saying, is the devil's in the detail as to the types of facilities and the levels of care of each individual resident within that particular facility. Whereas to compare yourself to not-for-profits to for-profits to your metropolitan locations is a little bit dangerous. So, is it mostly dangerous in the sense that it gives you a false sense of you're doing all you can? Or is it dangerous that just gives you a false sense of security?
Yeah, look, I guess one of the key things, if you're not comparing yourself to a benchmark, it doesn't matter. But if you are comparing yourself to a benchmark, then it may drive the inappropriate behaviours. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit about growth and profitability. Now, we were asked in by a organisation to come in and, peek under the hood and see how we're going. And when we met with one of the facility managers, one of the first comments they made was, well, we're doing pretty good with our ACFI. The piece of paper I get every month from an external provider shows that we're actually $3 a day better than the average. Now, straight away that made me think, okay, what's your process? And then when they started talking about their process, I realised hanging their hat on the average was quite dangerous. And what was actually really ironic, that was a site where we found them $206,000 in additional funding in less than 1 day. And the amazing thing is that was for care that was actually already being provided. So comparing themselves to the benchmark made them complacent. And, although that facility was doing well compared to the national average, they weren't receiving all the funding they were eligible for. So it needed to be remembered that it needs to be the care needs of the residents in the facility that we're benchmarked against, not some external factor and some external average that has no bearing on who you have in there.
And look, the title of the presentation was why benchmarking is costing you tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, I have had care workers come back to us saying, oh, we find that title a little bit contentious. And it's contentious in the sense of, yes, you are benchmarking, but you are costing yourself tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, in 85% of cases that we're finding in care homes. So benchmarking, as you say, is giving you a little bit of seems to be a ability to give you a false sense of security in regards to we are claiming above the national average, but as you've already pointed out, there's lots of other factors in there that it may be actually costing you some money. So when you're also talking about hostel versus occupancy, what does that mean?
So this is a nice little case study, an organisation we went to in regional Western Australia. Nice little spot, sun shining, the birds are singing, occupancy rates were a bit of an issue down there. Now, they had a facility that had a traditional hostel on one side, what they called their low care section, and the nursing home to high care, in inverted commas, on the other side. Now, the CEO of this organisation was like, look, our hostel, we're massively underfunded here. Can you come over and have a bit of a look? And, there's 60 or 70 residents in this hostel, and they're like, look, while you're over here, you're coming all this way, just, go and have a bit of a look at the nursing home, just as a bit of a health check as well. We went and had a look at the hostel, and the funding wasn't high, but what was amazing was the ACFI staff on that side of the building were claiming every dollar they were eligible for based on the care they were providing. Anytime a resident had a minor change in clinical status, they were comparing it to the ACFI, identifying whether or not they could get an uplift, and as soon as they were getting those claims in within 7 to 14 days. So at that side of the building, it was actually the occupancy levels that were driving the depressed funding. They had an issue with getting people in, and so it's just a case of, we need bums on seats. We're going to take anyone who, can pay a rate or a that, just to get the money coming in some way. So that part of the facility, they were actually doing everything they could. They were optimising their funding, but they were copping heaps of pressure from the financial staff saying, what are you guys doing over there? You're underfunded. And it was actually creating lots of stress for the staff. Whereas when we went over to the nursing home side of the building, they were complacent. Yet we're doing good over here. Everyone is pretty much a high, lots of high mediums. Everyone's either a medium or a high. They're rather complacent. It was actually $200,000 worth of funding we found on that side of the building. So you have a building split into two. One side is underfunded in inverted commas, but they're actually doing really well, and it's their occupancy issues and mission strategy that was letting them down. On the other side, they're comparing themselves to a benchmark, saying we're doing great, becoming complacent, and it was driving no behaviour. They weren't looking at the residents on a regular basis. They weren't reviewing the care plans every time a resident was changing. There was no process in place where if a care plan was changed, it got communicated to the ACFI staff. And I think that's just a really good example of within an organisation, even with inside benchmarking, can be dangerous.
Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, it's certainly, certainly one of the takeaway messages so far would be that, you know, it is benchmarking, if not necessarily dangerous, but we'll go through the dangers around benchmarking, but certainly it builds in a bit of perhaps complacency. So no, we are hitting the standard, we are hitting the average, but as you said, that might be a metropolitan not-for-profit average as composed to a regional remote average. So it is sort of quite interesting. So when you're also talking about sort of arbitrary benchmarks, what does that mean?
Yeah, so just this last week, I was called in to have a bit of a chat with an operations manager of a mission-based organisation who admitted residents of a certain demographic because that's what they were mandated to do by the board, and their target was $166. That's the target that they'll set for their financial performance of the facility. Now, when we actually went and had a look at the facility, they mentioned they had issues with occupancy rates because they were admitting people of a certain demographic. Pretty much it meant that sometimes they had less beds filled with others, and then when they did admit people, they were quite often very independent. They had very low behaviours in particular. So what it meant for that organisation was they had this artificial target, and they were admitting people at a certain level of funding, and they were averaging $158 a day. So what it meant was it was actually, you know, there was encouragement for staff to really push boundaries to get their funding up, and let's just say the previous validation performance wasn't that great because they were trying to reach this target that they couldn't control based on who they were admitting. Now, one of the staff members in this facility who was, you know, getting a fair bit of pressure and almost to the point of performance management saying they weren't performing, they could readily identify 8 residents in the facility who were obvious mission-based admissions. They were people who were very independent. One of them was still driving. During the course of a meeting, we actually saw 3 of them walk past that been down to the shops. Now, when we actually took those residents' funding out of the equation, the average for the organisation was $174. So again, it depends on where did this $166 come from? No one really seemed to know, even though that was a target, that was a KPI people had to achieve. That was driving negative behaviour, but at the same time, this person's KPIs were being impacted by another person's KPIs who had occupancy as a KPI. So there was just this massive mix of, we've got these financial targets, but we need to meet them at all costs. But when you look at, you know, when you get under the hood, they're actually doing really well from an ACFI perspective when you take out, you know, those outliers.
So in that scenario, effectively the mission of having a certain demographic wasn't aligned to the financial realities of having that demographic in their system. But when you actually took those mission-based people out of the funding equation, they were actually doing incredibly well, above their ACFI benchmarks. So that kind of, as you said, it comes back to the detail of knowing to say, yes, if we are, effectively what you're saying is you have, if we stick to our particular mission in that case, that's absolutely fine, and that's the purview of the organisation. But those mission-based people, we're only claiming what we can around their level of care that's needed, and those people have the need for that level of care. We can't sort of manufacture this out of nothing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was just a matter of getting everyone on the same page, but those benchmarks were being used as a performance measure inappropriately.
Okay. It's interesting because, as you say, the sense of mission, and there are very, of the 2,700 care homes, there are very much a sense of individual purpose within each care home, and aligning that with the financial mission becomes quite important, obviously. So, okay, cool. Thank you for that. And the other points here within organizational performance and remoteness.
Yeah, look, so even from that perspective, if you've got a multi-site organisation who does have a clearly identified market position, they've differentiated themselves in terms of the residents it attracts, and it's got a consistent capital strategy, then you'd think that benchmarking within the same organisation should work. But the reality is it doesn't. So we're working with one organisation where the lowest funded facility was actually the one with the best active performance. And, despite getting the most heat from their chief financial officer, this lovely facility in regional New South Wales had the lowest funding in the entire organisation, but it was to do with the people that they could actually admit in that organisation. Whereas the facility with the highest number of highs, over 60% of them, was actually the one where the most eligible funding was found. We found them over $100,000, even though they had the highest level of funding, had the highest level of highs. And again, they weren't getting the pressure because the measure of performance wasn't a process or a lead indicator, it was a lag indicator. You're getting this many dollars per day, so you must be doing something awesome, keep it up. You guys at this other facility are only getting this many dollars per day, you guys are doing something terrible, pick up your game. When the reality is, we look at the processes they have in place, their claiming patterns, how long it took them to get a claim in once the resident's care needs were identified, their validation outcomes. It was the smaller facility, the lowest funding, that was actually doing the best. Again, it came down to who could they get in the door and what were their care needs.
It does seem to be that the financial performance of many organisations is obviously absolutely dependent on the level of care that's being provided. We can't manufacture a level of care for an audience that's not required to receive it. So it's all very, very important information to come through. So, and I guess from a next perspective, what are some of the simple strategies to increase funding that people can do?
Well, I guess on that point, if you are going to use a benchmark, you've got to have a benchmark that takes into consideration what state you're in, your level of remoteness, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit status, and your size. Because otherwise, the benchmarks are meaningless. But even then, like any KPI architecture, it's not just about the lag indicators, it's about the lead indicators. So one of the key things is, rather than actually say this is our benchmark, the first thing we should be looking at is doing actually a clinical gap analysis of every resident in the facility and comparing what their current care needs are versus their current active status. So at the end of the day, you could be getting $150 as a round number. You could be getting $200 as a round number per day. We go out and we look at every single resident and we identify a couple that can go up. Then when we find our average rate should actually be $211, that's what the benchmark should be. It's about benchmarking internally based on our resident cohort. So that's the first step. And I guess taking into consideration with that, in some cases, having one resident who's highly funded move out of a facility and another resident who moves in and isn't as highly funded, that can impact your average daily rate by $1 or $2 per day. If you've got 4 or 5 residents who have turned over in the space of a few months, your daily rate could drop by a number of dollars. Doesn't necessarily mean you're performing poorly from an active perspective. It's the reality of who you have in the facility.
So empowering the individual site managers with that data to go back to their operations directors, if you will, and say, well, this is the reality of the cohorts coming into our facility. Then that's basically that's the reality. And if you are in a remote area, you can't basically go and find more high risk residents. You can only go by the audience type that you actually have.
Absolutely. So doing that as a once-off is quite valuable in identifying those residents we're not getting the right level of funding for based on the care we're already providing. But then as a lead indicator, as a KPI, having KPIs and measures in place with relation to the time between when each resident was last assessed according to their eligible funding. So organisations that do well, they actually have a measure for the average number of days between when each resident was clinically assessed and compared with their ACFI. And if that time frame is anything more than 2 or 3 months, that's where we've dropped the ball. So on that, the next thing is optimising the process. We still hear of some organisations out there who know of residents that we're not quite getting the amount of funding we should be getting, or once they identify a resident where an uplift is available, in some cases it's still taking 2, 3, 4 weeks for them to actually get a claim done. Optimising the process of we've identified a resident and their pack should be good to go in less than 7 to 14 days and submitted to get that funding up. Otherwise, we're just dragging the chain. There's a risk of the resident departing the facility. If we're looking at $50 a day increase, but we're taking an extra month to get it in, multiply that across 10 or 15 residents per annum, that's a significant impact on funding.
It does seem to be quite large, and one of the feedback we get a lot of is, and something that you've also spoken quite directly to, is that this involves your frontline care staff. This is not something, if you have an ACFI coordinator or a centralized ACFI team in a head office, if you're a multiple site facility, that's fine. But the people that really need to be involved with this are the frontline staff that are actually helping not just do the care plans, but seeing the changes in the patient that might mean a change to their care plan.
Absolutely, and this is usually the missing link. If your care staff can identify those areas of a resident that have changed, the resident's had a change in care need, and that's effectively communicated up each step of the chain, then that's when the ACFI is initiated and better funding outcomes achieved. But not only that, having staff training, not just in the frontline staff, but the next level as well, the clinical staff who are doing the clinical assessments. So many times a resident's, psychogeriatric assessment scales, the assessment tool used to measure the degree of cognitive impairment, quite often they're 1 or 2 points under, and that can be significant. It could be a case of the behaviour charts haven't been put out in a way, or followed up, most importantly, in a way that actually captures the frequency of behaviours. And not only that, training to, in some cases, the ACFI coordinators on how to, put a pack together in the most streamlined fashion that makes it validation ready. So there's no reliance on the ACFI coordinator being there when a validation occurs, because we all know that at the moment that the validation process, no longer can we say, oh, can we defer it for a week or 2, my ACFI person's not going to be there. The validators are coming anyway. So those packs need to be put together and robust and stand alone as a validation tool, so that way anyone can pick it up and understand what the resident's care needs are, and it accurately reflects the resident. Otherwise, there's a validation risk as well. So that training needs to permeate through all levels of the organisation.
So just in sort of summing up today, so thank you for sort of sharing that, Dan. And there are some questions that are actually coming through, but before we sort of get to those, what is sort of like your final further thoughts that on this to get this sort of stuff happening in organisations?
I guess one of the key things is, don't rely on an external benchmark. You need to rely on an internal benchmark. The only thing that you can really hang your hat on is, are we getting all the funding we should be based on our residents' care needs? And that's the gap we have to close. Comparing yourself to another organisation that's a different size, a different for-profit or not-for-profit status, they've got a different admission strategy and a different mission, is dangerous.
Okay.
So it all comes down to staff training.
And when we were sort of talking about what are the things that there's certainly areas in this that you actually can control, and there's when we pick up care operators telling us, oh no, we had a drop in funding, What should be very, very, very clear here is that there are areas of direct control from the frontline serving care staff that you can control elements of your funding that are currently perhaps leaking out of the system, and that begins with frontline staff. And there's, I guess, some other things around that have sort of come up is that the actual changes to the funding model themselves. Do you see that front-end carers really get involved in that, or not really? There's changes to the funding model which will happen at least yearly, but that shouldn't really change what the frontline ACFI person should do, should it? Or should it, or not really? What's your opinion on that?
No, not really. I mean, that's going to change how the ACFI staff approach submissions. For example, there's some residents now who may have a significant change in their health status. A organisation might submit their ACFI now, but in 6 months' time, when a mandatory reappraisal is due, the level of funding will actually drop to less than the current level. So in some cases, you don't actually want to do an ACFI. So that's the level of training that the ACFI coordinators need to know about the nuances of the new business rules and their projections for 2017. For the frontline staff, having training about identifying, what are the specific definitions and concepts of assessed need we need to know. How do I fill out these charts appropriately? That's the level of stuff that the frontline staff will need to know whether the ACFI exists or not, because that also provides better care outcomes for the resident too.
Okay, so some of the questions from the audience as we're wrapping up that are coming through electronically. Basically, the question was if either areas, or what areas do you think are most valid for benchmarking between facilities outside of ACFI? So they're saying obviously around funding it should be individualised. What are some areas where you see benchmarks are very useful between facilities?
I guess to preface that question, I just need to make a point that you can only really benchmark against a similar cohort. And I use the example of if you got a 100-bed not-for-profit organisation in a major city in New South Wales, you really need to be benchmarking yourself against those types of organisations. And the reason I say that is, let's say we have a multi-site organisation that operates across multiple states, and they've got solar panels installed. The electricity rates and cost in Queensland is going to be different than in Tasmania, where you've got different levels of sunshine. So all actual benchmarks should be controlled for some of those factors. So there might be some things about levels of staffing compared to the amount of ACFI we've got. That's an appropriate benchmark, an appropriate ratio. But first of all, we need to make sure that the average daily bed rate is actually a measure of ACFI performance as well as a reflection of the clinical profile of the residents. Unless you're controlled for that first, then the number's actually meaningless. But once you get a ratio of dollars per day to staff hours, that can then be meaningful. But you've also got to make sure you've got an optimised schedule as well. So there's all these different factors you need to control for in there. Some benchmarks that you may want to look at are process benchmarks. Do we have a system in place where every resident's care is compared to their average ACFI at least 3 monthly? Now that's a good benchmark. Every resident who's had a change in health status outside of that care plan cycle has had their ACFI reviewed within 48 hours. Now that's a good benchmark, because they're the sort of things that organisations who deal well with the ACFI don't get downgraded, do well on. And similarly as well, your benchmark should be, did we lose $0 of money of validation? Because that is an appropriate benchmark, because if you're doing it right, you shouldn't lose anything.
There's an interesting question here from a care home with a, I won't say the name to protect the innocent. It was, how do we, often ACFI is deemed as a financial metric, or it's all about money. When we're talking to frontline care staff about the importance of money, do you have any tips or suggestions for how to bring up ACFI in a non-ACFI way?
Yeah, well, look, I guess when we actually speak to care staff and let them know the ACFI is a reflection of the resident's care needs, and that then pays for your hours, pretty much if we don't document, it doesn't show that the resident has the care needs, which means that the staffing hours aren't going to be reflected. So it's more like the ACFI is a measure of resident dependency, and that level of dependency, which is given as a dollars per day metric, then determines the number of hours. So making that linkage between ACFI and also staff wages seems to resonate, because when you say, look, if we don't have our ACFI right, we can't afford additional staff to care for the residents. That's when we can't have additional hours, we can't have that swing shift or that extra person on for showers. They seem to resonate with that. So the care staff, they're smart when it comes to that sort of stuff. They get that, but we just need to take the time and explain, what does the ACFI do? It pays for wages.
Yeah. A question here about language. Is there a way where many of our staff have languages other than English? Do you have any tips? I'm not sure if it relates just to ACFI. Do you have any tips for how to start this conversation where English is a second or a third language of staff?
Well, look, I guess one of the key things there is, there's 12 areas within the ACFI, and let's just pick on the first one, eating. Now, if a resident's nutrition and requirements is that they don't need their food cut up and they are independent in their eating, then even for people who have low levels of literacy, English as a second language, if we explain to them, hey, this particular resident, we shouldn't actually have to do anything for them, they're completely fine, they do get that. That's not a language thing. So then we need to make sure that our care plans are succinct and paint that picture. So having a care plan that's tucked away in a computer where they can't actually access it on a day-to-day basis, and it's got 50 fields in it, is useless. Having a single care plan summary, which would say in 2 words, eating independent, they should get that. If not, some organisations have pictures, and it might be a picture of, their food getting cut up or their food not getting cut up. Now, again, it's about training our staff to identify, see this picture here, we shouldn't have to cut up this resident's food. If there's a change, let me know and we'll update the picture. Yep. And it can be something as simple as that.
Okay, and the last question here before we sort of wrap up is, in light of that care plan, I think that actually prompted a discussion point here is, what is in your experience is the best example of a care plan?
The best example of a care plan is the one that the care staff have access to and read it. is my honest opinion. Yep. Now, having a single A4 piece of paper which highlights each of the residents' key care needs and the staff have access to it is the most user-friendly for the frontline staff. What that does mean, though, is if that's the summary and there is a more comprehensive care plan, we need to make sure there's a system in place that every time there's a change made, it's also reflected on that care plan summary, and not vice versa as well. So we could have the most detailed, beautiful, in-depth care plan that talks about assessed needs, levels of intervention, expected outcomes, and all of this sort of stuff. But if no one reads it, it's absolutely useless. Yep. At the other end of the spectrum, we could have a care plan which just highlights what are the key things you need to be doing for this resident. If no one reads it, it's useless. If it's simple, staff can read it, it's in their face and it's accessible, so whenever they go see the resident, they can see it, and then they can identify if there's a change. That's the most effective version of the care plan. So word of warning, if your care plan is on a computer and staff don't log on and have a look at it when they go see the resident, you may as well not have it.
I guess that was a very good way to sort of finish, is that what is the best sort of content, or what is the best sort of care plan, is effectively one that will actually be used. And as you said, if that's a piece of paper on a clipboard, or if that's a manager with a tablet, or if you've got a care system, that there are also very, very important insights. So on behalf of sort of Learning Suite and Health Extend, thank you, Michael, for your time. And for those people that actually want to naturally enough see some of these content types that actually are available for the individual carers in individual care home situations, they can go hit the care tab at the Learning Suite library, or reach out to myself or Michael if you'd like to see how some organisations are actually using this particular piece of content. And hand on heart, Michael, in sort of 20 odd years of playing in the learning space, I have never seen something where learning can have such a direct impact so quickly with just very, very simple changes, both from a care perspective and also from a financial and operations perspective. It's actually good business sense, it's good care sense, and it's actually good for staff as well. So it sort of ticks all the boxes. If you get your ACFI right, everybody actually ends up with a better outcome. It's sort of like a win-win-win.
Yeah, look, and just on that, to highlight that point, if you train your staff and it only leads to one resident being identified where one category shift occurs, that can be a $15,000 increase in revenue for a pretty small investment. That's a pretty good return in the stock market. I'd buy shares in that.
Exactly. So, and that seems to be the thing, is if you're going to benchmark to yourself, get the category shift happening to the level of care that you actually provide, not compared to everyone else, and basically go from there. And so thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you all for attending and sticking around from everywhere, from WA to Northern Territory, from far north Queensland. We've got two from the Philippines, one from Vietnam, and somebody who's logged in from the west coast of the United States. So obviously people are thinking about care plans and benchmarking on different sides. So without further ado, thank you very much for your time, Michael, and thank you to the audience. And we're pleased to say our next webinar will be in a few weeks' time, and we look forward to taking you up on the topics as well. So thank you, Michael.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers. Bye.